I was sitting in on a quarterly strategy meeting last week. The CEO was at the front, clicking through this slide deck, packed with aggressive red arrows, risk assessment charts, the whole 9 yards, and the entire presentation. I mean, the company's whole strategy for the next 18 months was built on this one solid assumption. The trade war was just the new normal.
Right. That was the baseline thinking for so many.
Exactly. He was talking about supply chain fortification, decoupling, managing permanent tariffs exposure, all with this grim but really confident certainty. And he's mid-sentence, outlining some multi-million-dollar shift to a new market.
Okay.
When an assistant just quietly walks up, places a phone on the lectern, screen up. He pauses, kind of annoyed, glances down. The room goes absolutely silent. He just stares at the phone.
Wow.
Doesn't click to the next slide. Doesn't finish his sentence. All that certainty just, poof, evaporated from his face. He finally looks up, not really at anyone, and just says, they've agreed to a truce, a 1-year truce.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Yeah.
A handshake none of us saw had made his entire reality, this whole strategic fortress he'd built, instantly fragile. And it really struck me, after years of everyone adapting to the fight, maybe the most destabilizing thing that could possibly happen was peace.
And that anecdote, I think, perfectly captures the high-stakes reality we're really digging into today, because this wasn't, a comprehensive resolution. It wasn't a return to how things were before 2018.
Not at all.
It was a temporary, very deliberate pause in the immediate hostilities, a critical 12-month window.
Yeah.
And the real story, the strategic story, isn't just that the truce happened. It's how a major global power chose to, maximize that fleeting stability.
To use that time.
To use that time to execute these deep, long-term structural shifts in its economy and, frankly, its place on the global stage. For companies, strategists, governments, that unexpected pause demanded immediate, pretty radical reevaluation.
Exactly. So for you listening, our mission today is to unpack precisely how China utilized that 1-year trade truce. They didn't see it as like downtime, a time to relax their strategic muscles.
No, quite the opposite.
They viewed it as a protected runway, a chance to accelerate fundamental domestic and global strategies. We're going to focus on 3 sort of interconnected pillars that really define this shift. There's the acceleration of this thing called the dual circulation strategy, then reinforcing multilateral diplomacy and global influence, and finally, that urgent push for technological self-reliance.
A really comprehensive strategy running just beneath the surface of that temporary peace.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the architecture, the nuts and bolts of the truce itself.
Right. The context of this de-escalation is, I think, critical to understanding the clock that suddenly started ticking for everyone. The framework for the agreement, it was largely hammered out during some pretty intense back-channel talks, high-ranking officials meeting in Kuala Lumpur.
Okay, so serious negotiations behind the scenes.
Very serious. It signaled the maturity of the process, really. And this groundwork was then ratified, made official, following that face-to-face meeting between the leaders in Busan, South Korea. Publicly, though, it was presented more as a necessary breather.
A breather, yeah.
Amidst all this global economic uncertainty, a softening demand curve, it was framed as just catching a breath.
And breather really is the key word, isn't it? Because like we said, it was de-escalation, not resolution. So let's look at the specifics. What did the U.S. actually concede? What tariff rollbacks offered this breathing room?
Okay, the primary U.S. concession really focused on rolling back 2 significant tariff measures. These had severely impacted Chinese manufacturers, but also American consumers, let's not forget.
Sure.
First, there was a notable reduction, quite significant actually, of the tariff often linked, rightly or wrongly, to the fentanyl category of Chinese exports. That rate was cut from 20% back down to 10%.
Okay, 10 percentage points. That sounds small, but...
Yeah. Well, numerically, it might seem small, but that 10% reduction provided immediate, tangible relief. It actually lowered China's overall average tariff rate when you factor in all the previous tranches from an average of about 57% down to 47%.
Wow, okay. That is significant. That's the difference between staying afloat and going under for some businesses.
Yeah.
For those really margin-thin industries, 10 points of tariff relief can instantly free up serious capital.
Absolutely. And the second major component was the suspension of that additional 24% retaliatory tariff that had been threatened earlier in the year. Remember that?
Vaguely, yes. The Liberation Day tariffs, some pundits call them.
That's the one. So suspending that meant the tariffs would stay at the reduced 10% rate, well, contributing to that 47% average for the full year of the truce. They wouldn't suddenly surge back up to that punishing 34% level, or rather add 24 points on top.
So predictability for a year.
Exactly, a full year of predictability. That allowed businesses to actually plan production, plan shipping schedules, without the constant fear of some imminent overnight escalation.
And it wasn't just tariffs, right? The truce also addressed some of the logistical friction, which, is often a hidden cost in these trade wars.
Yes, that's a really important point. The U.S. paused those controversial port fees it had started charging on Chinese vessels docking at American ports. These fees, implemented under Section 301 authority, were actually set to rise incrementally. So pausing them was a big deal. China, in turn, reciprocated. They suspended their corresponding countermeasures against U.S. vessels for that same one-year period.
So a mutual stand down on the shipping front.
Yeah, this de-escalation in the maritime and logistics sectors was a crucial, very practical cooling-off measure. It was maybe categorized as an easier concession because it didn't really touch the core structural issues we'll get into.
Right.
But its effect on global trade stability and, frankly, shipping rates was immediate and positive.
Okay, so if the U.S. offered short-term tariff relief and some logistical stability, what did they get in return? What specific high-value concessions did China make?
China's key concessions really centered on two areas that were, let's say, of immediate political and economic sensitivity for the U.S. The first one was a promise to maintain the flow of rare earth minerals.
The rare earth. Always critical.
Always. And this was a critical reversal, or maybe more accurately, a suspension of these expanded export controls they'd announced just weeks before the truce back on October 9th. Those controls included some highly disruptive extraterritorial provisions.
Meaning they could affect companies outside China.
Potentially, yes. They would have impacted supply chains globally. So by suspending these, China removed an immediate, almost existential threat to key American industries.
Yeah, that rare earth concession alone feels huge, given how much relies on those minerals, defense tech, green energy, everything.
Precisely. The second major commitment was, well, highly visible and politically very important back in the U.S., a pledge to ramp up purchases of U.S. agricultural products.
The Farm Belt relief.
Exactly, specifically targeting significant volumes of soybeans and sorghum. This was clearly designed to provide immediate relief for U.S. farm states, many of which had been, severely impacted by China's retaliatory tariffs, and the subsequent shift in where they bought their agricultural goods, particularly turning towards Brazil.
Okay, so these reciprocal actions, they certainly sound significant on the surface, but we have to keep reminding ourselves, and you listening, that this whole arrangement was fundamentally temporary.
Absolutely temporary.
So what did the truce fail to resolve? And why did that failure, paradoxically maybe, become an advantage for China's longer-term planning?
Well, the agreement was basically built on the premise of retaining leverage. Both sides intentionally kept their main sources of conflict ready to deploy again. The truce simply didn't address the structural divergence between the two economies. Crucially, the U.S. kept its existing tariff structure in place. Even at that reduced average rate of 47%, this was still roughly 40 percentage points above the historical pre-trade war norm.
40 points higher than usual. Wow.
Yeah, so this ensured that if the truce broke down, those tariffs could snap right back instantly. And China, for its part, retained its underlying rare earth controls, the ones that existed before that October 9th expansion. So they kept long-term control over this strategic resource.
It sounds less like a truce and more like agreeing to pause the shooting, but keeping your finger firmly on the trigger.
That's a pretty good analogy. That's exactly the strategic posture. And several really high-stakes issues were explicitly left unresolved, ensuring that long-term uncertainty remained baked in.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the massive geopolitical flashpoint, the status of Taiwan. Reportedly, that wasn't discussed during the meeting at all, just left untouched.
Which leaves this huge source of friction just simmering.
Completely. Furthermore, there was no concrete resolution regarding the sale of NVIDIA's most powerful AI chip, specifically the Blackwell chip, to China. That remains a key point of technological contention.
Why is the Blackwell chip specifically so critical that it remained an unresolved leverage point? What does it do?
Well, the Blackwell chip essentially represents the absolute cutting edge in AI training and deployment. Controlling its sale is effectively controlling the speed and the capability of the highest end of the AI ecosystem in China.
So it's a bottleneck.
It's a potential bottleneck, yes. By leaving this unresolved, the U.S. maintains its ability to sort of place a ceiling on China's highest-end computing power. It creates this constant technological dependency, acting like a sort of Damocles hanging over China's own R&D efforts in AI.
Okay. And you also mentioned TikTok. China agreed to work on the divestiture deal, but the details weren't finalized.
Correct. They agreed to work constructively on it, but the final structure, the ownership, the oversight mechanisms, none of that was formally agreed upon. So this highly visible, politically charged security issue also just remained in limbo.
So lots of major issues still hanging fire.
And let's not forget the underlying structural issues, the things that actually caused the trade war in the first place.
Right, the big ones.
Intellectual property protection, or the perceived lack thereof, forced technology transfer requirements for foreign companies operating in China. The immense role in the subsidies provided to state-owned enterprises, these were completely untouched by the truce.
So the core disagreements remained.
Absolutely. Analysis from places like the Wall Street Journal at the time noted that, yes, the détente provided immediate market relief, but it did nothing to reconcile the fundamental divergence between these two economic superpowers who were essentially racing for supremacy in key 21st century technologies. It was, temporary stability purchased at the cost of not addressing any of the long-term problems.
Okay, so given that the stability was so temporary, just 1 year, it makes perfect strategic sense, doesn't it? That China would use this pause not to kind of double down on fragile exports, but to accelerate its own domestic resilience.
Exactly.
Which brings us neatly to the centerpiece of their long-term economic planning, this dual circulation strategy, or DCS. We probably need to go deep on what this actually means conceptually.
Yeah, we do. The dual circulation strategy is arguably the most fundamental paradigm shift in Chinese economic thinking since the whole reform and opening up period back in the late 1970s. It was proposed by President Xi Jinping around May 2020 and then really cemented in state policy through the 14th five-year plan.
Yeah.
And the core idea is to make the domestic economy, what they call domestic circulation, the dominant engine of economic growth. The primary driver.
Dominant, okay. Not the only one, but the main one.
The main one. This is then supplemented by continued, but let's say strategically managed international engagement. That's the international circulation part.
That prioritization of domestic demand, though, that feels like a huge historical pivot.
Yeah.
For decades, China's model was so fundamentally outward-looking, right?
Yeah.
Driven by exports, foreign direct investment, integrating into global supply chains.
Absolutely. And that's why this is such a big deal. The prioritization of domestic demand as the dominant driver is a direct response to those powerful external forces we saw in the preceding years. The strategy was explicitly driven by two major shocks.
Which were?
First, the ongoing global geostrategic friction manifesting as these trade tensions, technological competition, decoupling talk. And second, the massive economic disruption and the supply chain fragility that was brutally exposed by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. Everyone felt that.
Everyone felt that. And the central government clearly saw this volatile environment and recognized that relying so heavily on global demand or on foreign inputs for critical sectors was becoming an unacceptable vulnerability.
So what's the ultimate structural intention behind DCS? It sounds like it's more than just, say, a typical stimulus plan.
Oh, much more. It's really about systemic resilience and strategic autonomy. The goal is to build an economy that is structurally less dependent on the, frankly, unpredictable nature of foreign trade, and crucially, to reduce reliance on foreign supply chains for critical goods and materials.
Getting control of the essentials.
Exactly. The policy explicitly calls for building a domestic production and supply system. That's a phrase you hear a lot that is self-developed, controllable, safe, and reliable. The aim is to ensure continued economic operation even in, quote, critical moments or extreme conditions. DCS is essentially China's comprehensive blueprint to insulate itself from future geopolitical coercion and supply chain shocks.
This high-level policy talk can feel a bit abstract sometimes, but the real significance, I think, is seen when it filters down. When you see how it affects an individual business owner facing all this uncertainty.
That's right.
And the story you found about Mr. Huang, the small electronics business owner, it seems to capture perfectly how this strategic warning translated into concrete action during the truce.
It really demonstrates the difference between viewing the truce as, just a relief versus viewing it as a strategic necessity. So Mr. Huang, he ran a small electronics business in Yiwu, the famous trading city. Historically, almost 90% of his revenue came from exports to the U.S.
Wow, 90%. Highly exposed.
Extremely exposed. So when the trade war tariffs first hit, his American orders they virtually evaporated, gone. Now, the one-year truce did bring his American clients cautiously back to the table, sniffing around for orders again. But for Mr. Huang, any celebratory feeling was apparently entirely absent.
He saw it differently.
Yeah.
He viewed the temporary peace not as, oh, good, things are back to normal, but more as confirmation that his entire livelihood was basically hostage to political decisions made thousands of miles away.
Precisely. He saw the writing on the wall, and his response was like a textbook implementation of dual circulation at the micro level. He immediately took half of his available working capital.
Half. That's a big move.
A huge move, and aggressively invested it internally. But this involved not just like survival tactics, but future-proofing. He opened these high-profile digital storefronts on major domestic platforms, Pinduoduo, JD.com.
Just getting Chinese consumers.
Exactly. And crucially, he shifted his product design and his marketing focus entirely away from meeting U.S. consumer requirements and towards appealing specifically to Chinese consumer tastes and trends. He apparently described the truce as the crucial air cover he needed.
Air cover, I like that.
Yeah, the air cover he needed to build a stable domestic foundation without the immediate anxiety of new tariffs potentially decimating his core business revenue again, at least for that 12-month period.
That's fascinating. He didn't wait for some permanent deal that might never come.
Yeah.
He used the temporary stability to fundamentally reorient his strategic center of gravity inward. He used the pause to accelerate his business's own domestic circulation.
And this strategic pivot, multiplied by potentially millions of Mr. Huangs across China, that is the engine driving the success of dual circulation. But we have to remember, the strategy is defined as dual.
Right, not just domestic.
Not just domestic. While the domestic focus is the dominant core, the international circulation component actually requires opening up to the outside world more effectively in some ways.
How so?
Well, the goal is to enhance overall economic resilience, primarily by diversifying partners away from such heavy reliance on the U.S. market.
So it's not about becoming isolationist. It's more about hedging and diversification, lessening dependence on any single player.
Exactly. It's strategic engagement, but designed specifically to minimize the impact of U.S. volatility or potential future conflict. And we saw evidence of this external effort, this international circulation piece, accelerate dramatically during this period of the truce.
What kind of evidence?
Key actions included, for example, the massive diplomatic effort that finally culminated in the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, RCEP.
Which links China much more deeply with its Asian neighbors.
Hugely important. And RCEP is, by population and GDP, the world's largest free trade zone, isn't it? So that's a very significant move to cement regional economic integration.
Definitely a counterweight.
A crucial counterweight to bilateral dependence on the U.S. Furthermore, you had the in-principle conclusion of the bilateral investment agreement with the European Union around that time, too.
It's an EU deal, right?
Which demonstrated a sustained, high-level effort to expand global trading and economic ties beyond the U.S. This commitment to multilateralism to these big regional blocs enhances resilience by ensuring that if the U.S. relationship falters again, major alternative markets and supply chains, namely Asia and Europe, are more secured.
Okay, but let me just push back on that slightly. If you're shifting your dependency from the U.S. to, say, Europe and Asia, does that truly achieve the stated goal of strategic autonomy? Or is it just, diversified dependency, spreading the risk rather than eliminating it?
That's a fundamentally critical question, and it gets right to the heart of what autonomy means in the context of DCS. They recognize, I think, that true isolation in the modern global economy is impossible and probably undesirable anyway.
Right.
So autonomy in this context seems to mean two things. First, securing the really critical foundational inputs, things like food security, energy security, and high technology, primarily domestically. We'll talk more about the tech piece later. Second, autonomy means having sufficient market and supply chain diversification, that's the international circulation part, so that no single external partner can exert catastrophic geopolitical leverage over you.
Ah, okay. So it's about leverage, not total independence.
Exactly. RCEP and the EU deal serve as these essential hedging mechanisms that reduce the vulnerability inherent in having all your eggs in one basket, essentially. It's about managing external risk so that the domestic engine, the domestic circulation, can remain stable and keep growing regardless of storms elsewhere. Okay, so to make that domestic engine really powerful, to make DCS succeed, you need a domestic market of just unparalleled size and vibrancy. It needs to be capable of absorbing massive manufacturing output and driving sustained consumption growth.
But China's always wrestled with these huge regional imbalances, right?
Yeah.
The prosperous coast versus the less developed inland regions. And more recently, I think you mentioned a growing north-south economic divide, too.
That's exactly right. There are deep, long-standing internal economic inequalities. So the stability offered by the truce, that air cover Mr. Huang talked about, it essentially gave the leadership the political and economic space to pour resources into addressing those inequalities.
By building up these integrated, consumption-driven hubs.
That's the essential linkage, yes. The success of DCS really hinges on stimulating coordinated regional development, particularly in these highly dynamic city clusters, which are designed to act as regional economic poles, pulling their surrounding areas up with them.
And this involves?
This involves immense investment in urban infrastructure, public services, high-speed rail, logistics networks, all designed to stimulate domestic consumption. It also directly supports China's massive urbanization goals. They're aiming for something like a 70% urbanization rate by 2030.
70%, that's huge.
It is. And policymakers explicitly believe this process will generate huge demand and increase effective supply, creating this virtuous cycle of domestic growth.
It sounds like economic engineering on a truly massive scale. And you mentioned earlier, this coordination seems highly centralized now, maybe more so than in the past.
That's a hallmark of the current administration, yes. While China went through periods of significant regional decentralization, since around 2013, the central government has really re-centralized control over these major strategic regional plans. They're using high-level plan making as the primary tool.
How does that work in practice?
You have these very high-level committees, like the Central Commission for Comprehensively Deepening Reform, directly overseeing and coordinating the development initiatives of these major city clusters. This ensures that all that regional growth directly serves the national DCS objective of building internal economic strength and resilience. It's top-down coordination.
Okay, let's get specific then. Which strategic city clusters were really highlighted in the 14th five-year plan as the crucial engines for this new paradigm? And how did the truce maybe allow specific integration efforts within them to accelerate?
The strategy really identifies three major established coastal clusters, plus one massive inland pole that's getting a lot of focus. The two most competitive integrated clusters, just based on sheer economic contribution, investment levels, innovation capability, are the Yangtze River Delta, YRD, and the Guangdong-Hong Kong-Macau Greater Bay Area, GBA.
Okay, let's start with the GBA. That one's always seemed incredibly complex, involving, three distinct legal and customs systems: Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau.
It is complex. The GBA is strategically defined by its deep international openness, its incredibly high concentration of manufacturing, especially advanced manufacturing, and the massive infrastructure projects connecting them all. You've got Shenzhen functioning as this national innovation and tech hub.
The Silicon Valley of China, some call it.
Right. And then you have Hong Kong remaining a major international financial center alongside Shenzhen's own growing financial clout. The GBA as a whole accounted for a staggering 11% of China's entire GDP back in 2020.
11% from that one cluster.
Yeah. But the challenge, the big challenge, which the truce perhaps gave them breathing room to accelerate work on, is harmonizing those different regulatory, legal, and customs regimes between Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Macau. That's the hard part.
And that harmonization.
Yeah.
That's the specific policy action that shows them using the pause strategically.
Absolutely. Policy documents and reports from that period indicate that the various GBA work groups focused intensely during the truce on what they call soft integration measures.
Soft integration, meaning?
Things like cross-border regulatory harmonization for professional services, lawyers, accountants, mutual recognition of professional qualifications across the boundaries, standardized customs procedures, especially for digital goods and services. This stuff is slow, painstaking, difficult work in normal times.
Full of local resistance, I imagine.
Full of resistance, yeah. But the relative certainty provided by that one-year pause seems to have allowed regional leaders, under central guidance, to prioritize this complex administrative reform over just firefighting immediate trade disputes day to day. The long-term goal is to transform the GBA into a truly world-class, seamlessly integrated cluster by 2030, driven now more by indigenous innovation and a more unified financial sector.
Okay. And the other coastal giant you mentioned, the Yangtze River Delta. The YRD.
The YRD, centered around Shanghai, is really the established economic powerhouse of China. It boasts arguably the best overall investment environment, huge innovation potential, and incredibly well-developed infrastructure networks, ports, rail, airports.
It's where capital and manufacturing efficiency really meet.
That's a good way to put it.
Right.
And together with the GBA, these two coastal clusters accounted for over 34%, more than a third of China's entire GDP in 2020.
A third of the economy in just those two regions.
Phenomenal concentration. The goal here in the YRD is maybe less about bridging fundamental legal divides, like in the GBA, and more about knocking down internal administrative hurdles between the different provinces and municipalities within the Delta, ensuring the smooth, efficient flow of land, capital, talent, data across the entire integrated region, which spans Shanghai and 3 provinces. They are the essential coastal twin engines meant to fuel the whole domestic circulation concept.
Okay, so if the coastal regions provide the economic heft, the dual circulation plan must also involve the inland regions, right? To address that unbalanced development we talked about. Otherwise, consumption demand just stays concentrated on the coast.
Precisely. And this is a key shift. The older model of supporting the central and western regions often involved massive, sometimes debt-fueled infrastructure spending, which yielded diminishing returns over time.
Building bridges to nowhere, some critics said.
Right. That model is now recognized officially as increasingly unsustainable. So the new focus shifts quite dramatically towards creating consumption-driven hubs further inland, places designed to be more self-sustaining economic poles, generating their own growth.
And the most prominent example of this strategic inland pivot is the Chengdu-Chongqing Economic Circle, the CCEC.
The CCEC is crucial in this new map. It's positioned as the most prominent new hub in the western region. It's seen as a really important junction under the Belt and Road Initiative, potentially connecting China's inland logistics networks with Central Asia and Europe.
So it has a geopolitical dimension, too.
Absolutely. Strategically, it leverages its relatively lower production costs compared to the coast, abundant land supply, and the massive potential of its own huge internal consumption market. We're talking well over 100 million people just in that core area. Even though it contributed a smaller slice of GDP in 2020, around 4.2%.
Still significant.
Still significant. And the state plans are clearly aimed at transforming it into a highly interconnected engine of national influence, purposefully driving growth away from the saturated, sometimes debt-heavy coastal regions towards the interior.
This internal geographical rebalancing isn't just east-west, though. You mentioned earlier they're also trying to address the north-south economic divide.
That's a critical strategic challenge, yes. The data is pretty stark. Northern China's share in the national GDP dropped quite significantly from about 43.2% in 2012 down to 38.1% in 2020, while the South's share increased correspondingly.
So the gap widened considerably.
It did. So the strategic concentration on the GBA and YRD in the South, alongside focused efforts on certain northern regions like the Beijing-Tianjin-Hebei cluster, the Jing-Jin-Ji area, is partly an attempt to re-engineer the economic map. To ensure regional stability and more balanced development supports that long-term consumption-driven growth model.
Okay, but this shift, this idea of shifting to consumption-driven growth via massive investment in city clusters, that's been a policy goal for years, hasn't it? Why is there confidence this time that this intense synchronized investment won't just inflate localized real estate bubbles instead of driving genuine sustainable consumption? Because that's happened before.
That is absolutely the highest risk factor in executing the DCS strategy, and policymakers are acutely aware of it. The confidence, at least according to the planning documents and analysis, seems to stem from that re-centralization of control we talked about, using those high-level committees.
So top-down discipline.
Essentially, yes. Unlike previous periods where localized stimulus sometimes led to, let's say, uncontrolled land speculation by regional officials looking to boost local GDP figures.
Right.
The current model uses very specific top-down planning to allocate funding towards essential public services, improving social safety nets, supporting industrial upgrading measures designed to actually increase household income and the propensity to consume, rather than just fueling asset inflation. And the argument is that the Truce provided the stable economic backdrop needed to enact the politically difficult decisions required to enforce the centralized discipline, often overriding local protective interests.
Ah, okay. So the truce was the moment they felt they had the necessary leverage and stability to impose internal structural discipline across competing regional governments.
Yeah.
To make sure the money went where they wanted it to go for the national strategy.
Precisely. They arguably used the temporary external calm to push through reforms aimed at addressing deep, long-standing internal imbalances and potential instabilities, all in the service of creating that robust domestic circulation required for long-term strategic autonomy.
Okay, so while that domestic engine was being aggressively retuned and coordinated internally, the other crucial part of the dual circulation strategy, the international circulation bit, required China to proactively manage its global diplomatic relationships, especially outside of the direct U.S. sphere of influence.
Yes, and this diplomatic push really seemed to coincide perfectly with the timing of the trade truce.
It was like a parallel track.
A very important parallel track. And it happened most prominently, perhaps, during the APEC summit, which was held that year in Gwangju, South Korea. Now, the crucial detail here, you might remember, is that the U.S. president made a very calculated decision to snub that major regional forum, stayed home, focused domestically.
Right, which created this massive strategic vacuum on the stage, didn't it? Handing President Xi Jinping basically center stage to frame China's diplomatic posture to the entire Asia-Pacific region, unchallenged at that moment.
Absolutely. It was a golden opportunity, diplomatically speaking, and Xi used that platform very effectively. He promised that China would actively help defend global free trade and uphold the multilateral trading system. The messaging was all about stability, global cooperation.
A deliberate contrast.
A very deliberate contrast to the U.S. rhetoric at the time, which often focused on conditionality, reciprocity, and sometimes unilateral actions. She explicitly called for maintaining supply chain stability, which was, a direct riposte to perceived U.S. decoupling efforts, and also for expanding cooperation in these future-facing fields like green industries and clean energy, trying to find common ground.
And the written remarks that were sent to the CEO summit alongside APEC, they reinforced this image too, right?
Yeah.
China as the stable, reliable partner.
Exactly. The language was very intentional. Xi's message included lines like, the more turbulent the times, the more we must work together, really reinforcing that theme of cooperation and shared global destiny. And regarding investment, he stated quite plainly, investing in China is investing in the future.
A clear pitch to global capital.
A very clear pitch, positioning the Chinese market as the essential growth opportunity in what was becoming a fiercely competitive global landscape. It was a signal to global investors that China, despite all the trade tension, remained committed to economic openness and, importantly, predictability.
Meanwhile, the rhetoric from the U.S. side, even with the truce in place, it sounded much more conditional, perhaps. I think Treasury Secretary Bessent was representing the U.S., and the emphasis was more on rebalancing trade relationships, ensuring fair and reciprocal terms, building resilient production networks to reduce dependence.
The contrast was quite stark, wasn't it? And arguably strategically beneficial for China's diplomatic goals at that moment. You had one side focusing intensely on stability, free trade, multilateral structures, the other focusing more on conditionality, reciprocity, and defensive disengagement or reshoring.
And this contrast wasn't just abstract talk. It was apparently felt quite keenly by the international business community, especially maybe those on the front lines of global logistics, who just desperately needed predictability above all else.
Yes, and this is where the perspective of Marcus, the German logistics manager you found, working at the port of Hamburg, becomes really illustrative. He had lived through the absolute chaos of the initial trade war years.
What did he describe?
Well, Marcus described how the trade war caused just massive disruption. Strangled supply chains, shipments being rerouted last minute, sometimes canceled altogether. Deep, paralyzing anxiety among his international clientele about whether their goods would ever arrive or what tariffs they might face.
A nightmare for logistics.
A total nightmare. And when the truce was announced, he apparently noted this fundamental difference in the diplomatic approach he was seeing globally. He felt that while the American focus still seemed to be on, quote, winning the negotiation through leverage and maintaining pressure,
right?
China's diplomatic efforts, particularly in Europe, seemed entirely concentrated on projecting stability and reinforcing multilateralism. He pointed to things like actively reinforcing trade pacts with German automakers, finalizing infrastructure deals in Italy and Central Europe under the BRI umbrella. It felt different.
So the practical implication for international businesses like Marcus's, whose main concern is just keeping predictable shipping lanes open.
Yeah, just keep the boxes moving.
It's pretty clear. The volatility inherent in that America First conditional approach felt inherently destabilizing, whereas China's proactive diplomatic push, emphasizing stability, committing to things like RCEP, the EU deal, felt far more reassuring to their long-term business calculus.
It really speaks to a successful strategic effort by China to manage its global reputation during that specific moment of bilateral de-escalation with the U.S. By seizing the spotlight at APEC, by actively engaging in these key trade pacts, China arguably portrayed itself quite effectively as the steady, reliable hand committed to globalization, contrasting sharply with the perceived volatility associated with U.S. trade policy at the time.
And this commitment to stability wasn't just, rhetoric or perception. The leaders actually institutionalized their economic relationship, at least temporarily, by agreeing to a structured dialogue, right?
Yes, that was a key outcome of the Truce agreement itself. They agreed to hold these quarterly review meetings to monitor progress on the commitments made.
Okay, regular check-ins.
Regular check-ins. And this signified a vital shift, potentially, toward a more stable, institutionalized framework for managing the economic relationship. Moving away from that reactive tariff-by-tariff, tweet-by-tweet decision-making we'd seen earlier.
Right.
The idea behind this dialogue track was reportedly to lock in a full year of leader-led diplomacy, ensuring that the economic relationship was governed by structured, predictable communication, at least for that year. And that institutional stability, that predictable framework, was precisely the kind of air cover needed back home to accelerate those difficult domestic structural reforms we were just talking about in Section 3. It all links together. Which brings us to the third critical pillar of China's strategy during this truce period, and this is perhaps the most vital one for their long-term strategic autonomy goals: accelerating technological self-reliance, or, what's often termed techno-nationalism.
Right. Building it at home.
Building it at home. And this drive, it's rooted in a deep historical understanding in China that technological independence is absolutely essential for national security, for national prestige. It's a lesson hard to learn through various historical periods of perceived vulnerability.
And the ongoing trade tensions, the export controls. They just made that historical imperative suddenly very immediate, very existential, didn't they? The trade war was fundamentally a tech war.
It absolutely was at its heart. And while initiatives like the National Medium and Long-Term Program for Science and Technology Development or the Made in China 2025 program have been driving this ambition for years.
Right, this wasn't brand new.
Not brand new at all. But the actual imposition of U.S. high-tech export controls, particularly on semiconductors, proved just how vulnerable China remained in certain critical areas to foreign technological coercion. The goal, therefore, became about guaranteeing systemic redundancy, ensuring that even if the U.S., say, pulled the plug on critical inputs tomorrow, the entire national security apparatus and key parts of the economic infrastructure wouldn't just grind to a halt.
Survival.
Untouched at a strategic level, yes.
Yeah.
And the temporary nature of the truce provided a very specific technological reprieve, a window they could exploit before restrictions inevitably returned or potentially got worse.
How so? What was the specific reprieve?
It was quite specific. The U.S. agreed, as part of the truce deal, to suspend its 50% ownership rule for 1 year. This rule had significantly restricted exports of certain technologies to entities with substantial Chinese ownership. Suspending it provided critical, though clearly temporary, relief from some of those high-tech export controls.
Okay.
But for the Chinese government and for its high-tech industries, this wasn't viewed as, oh, great, a pause in the tech war. It was viewed much more starkly as a rigid 12-month deadline.
A deadline.
A deadline. A window to close their most glaring vulnerability gaps before the full weight of U.S. export restrictions could potentially return, perhaps even stronger than before. That compressed, high-stakes timeline.
Yeah.
Wow. That must have created an immense amount of pressure within the high-tech sector, shifting the motivation from just commercial profit to something more like national technological survival.
Exactly. And engineer Zhang's story, the semiconductor engineer you mentioned, I think perfectly illustrates that psychological shift.
Tell us about her situation.
Okay, so engineer Zhang was working at a burgeoning semiconductor startup in Shanghai.
Yeah.
Like many indigenous Chinese firms in that space, her company was almost entirely dependent on American-made electronic design automation EDA software. That's the software used to design complex chips.
Absolutely critical tools.
Absolutely critical. And they also relied on specific high-end foreign components for their manufacturing process. This placed their entire operation at existential risk during the peak of the trade conflict, when access to these could be cut off at any moment.
Okay.
So when the one-year truce was announced, her CEO apparently immediately framed it internally, not as a reprieve, not as a vacation, but as a rigid 12-month deadline to secure the company's survival. They had to find or build an alternative solution for that EDA software, for those components, before the clock ran out. That's a fundamentally different psychological driver than just competing for market share, isn't it?
It's a world of difference. It's the difference between R&D driven by commercial opportunity and R&D driven by a national security mandate, filtering all the way down to the company level. For that entire year, Zhang and her team apparently worked with this intense, almost desperate energy.
Fueled by the deadline.
Fueled by the realization that this window of temporary peace was the critical air cover they needed to accelerate their indigenous R&D efforts, specifically focusing on finding or developing alternatives to that foreign EDA software. If they didn't make significant progress within that truce period, the company, and by extension the larger national goal of chip self-sufficiency, might be permanently compromised. That fear, that urgency, was apparently a very powerful motivator.
Okay, so that's the human story. Let's look at the broader metrics. Do they confirm this widespread acceleration of R&D spending and focus during this specific period?
The investment data certainly confirms the urgency and the scale of the push. Overall spending on research and development in China climbed a very significant 10.3% to hit a record $378 billion in 2020, right in that time frame.
10% jump in 1 year.
Yeah. And this massive, sustained financial push is what underpins the trajectory for China's total gross domestic expenditure on R&D, or GER. Projections at the time suggested it was on track to exceed that of the United States by around 2023.
Overtaking the U.S. in total R&D spend.
Potentially, yes. And critically, within that spending, there was a strategic increase in funding specifically for basic research.
Basic research. Why the focus there?
Because basic research, fundamental science, the real breakthrough stuff that's the hardest part to acquire from abroad through licensing or acquisition, you have to discover it yourself. So targets were set to significantly boost basic research's share of total research spending, moving beyond just applied R&D and reverse engineer.
Building the foundations for future breakthroughs, not just catching up.
Precisely. Now, the semiconductor industry is obviously the key technological choke point, the main battleground. How did the truce allow acceleration in this sector specifically, beyond just throwing more R&D money at it? This is where that coordinated state strategy really comes into play, heavily driven by the big fund.
A big fund.
The China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. It's this massive state-backed fund designed specifically to steer capital towards domestic chip development and manufacturing. Now, during the truce, the suspension of certain high-tech export restrictions meant that Chinese firms had temporary access to some foreign components and tools they might not have had otherwise.
Yeah.
But the strategic focus of the big fund apparently pivoted during this period. Instead of just using the money to try and ramp up existing fabrication capacity using available foreign tech.
Which might have been the short-term reaction.
Right. They seem to have aggressively prioritized funding for indigenous tool development.
Oh. Focusing on the machines that make the chips, not just the chips themselves. The shovels in the gold rush.
Exactly, a very strategic shift. They recognized that dependency on foreign lithography machines, like the super advanced EUV machines from ASML in the Netherlands or other sophisticated manufacturing tools, was potentially a fatal flaw in the long run.
Because those could be cut off.
They were being restricted. So the truce, ironically, allowed them to funnel capital, maybe capital that might have otherwise been earmarked for urgent foreign procurement to keep lines running, directly toward the indigenous development of things like advanced lithography, even if not EUV yet, specialized materials, and crucially domestic EDA software, addressing exactly the vulnerability engineer Zhang's company was facing. It looks like a tactical use of temporary stability to shift capital towards systemic, foundational innovation, not just capacity.
That makes sense. And is this investment translating into measured leadership in other specific high-tech sectors as well? Is it confirming the breadth of the strategic push beyond just chips?
It seems to be, yes. A study cited around that time concluded that China held a leading position, or was rapidly closing gaps, in some 37 out of 44 critical and emerging technologies tracked.
37 out of 44. Like what?
Things like 5G internet infrastructure, where Huawei was a global leader despite U.S. pressure, high-density electric batteries for EVs, where companies like CATL dominate, hypersonic missiles were another area mentioned, and the government maintained these explicit national goals, like becoming the undisputed world leader in artificial intelligence by 2030.
The AI ambition.
Leveraging its huge advantages in data generation, connectivity from 5G rollout, and its massive e-commerce and fintech markets that provide real-world AI applications at scale.
Supercomputing is intrinsically linked to AI capability, needing massive processing power. What's the status there? Is that also part of the self-reliance push?
Very much so. In supercomputing, China is highly advanced and intensely focused on developing indigenous architectures. As far back as 2017, China actually held the majority of the world's top 500 most powerful supercomputers, something like 202 out of 500. And they possess extremely powerful systems like the Sunway Taihu Light. Now, crucially, the Sunway Taihu Light uses Chinese-designed and Chinese-made processors.
So demonstrating success in component self-reliance there.
A key success, yes. They are actively developing the capacity to manufacture all critical components domestically for future machines and are racing to build the first exascale supercomputer, that next generation of power, entirely with indigenous hardware. The goal is clearly to reduce and eventually eliminate reliance on foreign architectures like the dominant x86 from Intel or AMD or even ARM designs.
Okay, so a broad and deep push. Finally, looking at the overall metrics, how does the world generally view the output of this massive technological sprint? Does it register globally?
Well, the data is pretty undeniable. China consistently ranks highly on the Global Innovation Index, climbing steadily into the top tier, reaching 10th globally in the 2025 rankings mentioned in the outline. Furthermore, and this is perhaps most indicative of the sheer scale of the indigenous push, it ranks #1 globally by a huge margin in patent filings, utility models, and trademarks registered.
Just the sheer volume of IP.
The sheer volume. Now, volume doesn't always equal quality or impact, but that level of intellectual property generation, combined with the clear strategic focus on high-tech manufacturing dominance and indigenous innovation in critical sectors. It really confirms that the one-year trade truce provided the perfect geopolitical breathing room. It was the necessary deadline, in a way, to consolidate and dramatically accelerate that fundamental shift toward technological self-reliance across the entire industrial spectrum. #tag outro. So, the key finding, when we put all these different pieces together, you have the carefully orchestrated concessions in the truce, the accelerated dual circulation push focusing inward, the centralized regional planning driving that, the proactive diplomatic outreach building alternative ties, and then this almost desperate technological sprint.
It paints quite a picture.
It really does. And the picture is that the one-year trade truce, which might have seemed like just a pause in the conflict from the outside, was actually utilized by China as a precisely timed opportunity. It functions simultaneously as both a window of necessary stability and as a hard deadline.
Stability and deadline, yeah.
And this period allowed them to systematically accelerate their long-term strategic agenda across the board, securing domestic demand via those integrated city clusters, reinforcing global diplomatic ties through assertive multilateralism, and maybe most urgently, accelerating that indigenous technological capacity to ensure systemic redundancy and future autonomy.
So the real strategic power then, it lay not just in the diplomatic agreement itself, the piece of paper that reduced the immediate friction, but in the highly coordinated, deeply integrated national strategy that was running full steam simultaneously just beneath that temporary surface of peace.
Exactly. It demonstrated this remarkable long-term focus, strategic patience maybe, that seemed to transcend the immediate market fluctuations or the day-to-day battles over tariffs. They effectively used the external stability to enforce and accelerate internal transformation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Indeed. And the result is that the truce didn't really restore the past status quo of globalization, did it? By providing the necessary conditions, the air cover, to accelerate these deep structural transformations, the pause actually maybe permanently cemented a dramatically new strategic direction for China's economy, shifting its center of gravity firmly inward while simultaneously diversifying and strengthening its external ties very much on its own terms.
Which really highlights that in modern geopolitical competition, maybe the ability to leverage a moment of de-escalation, a pause for deep structural transformation. Maybe that's ultimately more impactful than winning any short-term tariff battle.
The truce didn't restore the past, it really just cemented a dramatically new strategic future.